Scholarship trash like you should know your place. With those vicious words, James Lawton, heir to the most powerful family in the state, shoved Carmen Cowan toward the edge of his family's estate pond. The crowd of prep school elites gasped and pressed closer, phones lifted high to capture the spectacle. The crystalline water churned as shadows beneath the surface stirred. Piranhas, dozens of them, circling with predatory hunger. He thought he was about to destroy the quiet outsider who dared challenge his reign of terror. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would flip the script entirely, turning his triumphant sneer into desperate pleas for mercy and revealing a truth dark enough to shatter the Lawton dynasty forever. Where are you watching from, your phone or your laptop? Drop a comment below and stay until the final moment. You won't believe how the hunted becomes a hunter and how one girl's unshakable honor becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. Introduction: the predator and the protector. A sharp crack echoed across the pristine grounds of Ashford Academy as a rock struck flesh. The stray cat, a mangy tabby that had wandered through the iron gates, shrieked and collapsed near the marble fountain. Its leg twisted at an unnatural angle. James Lawton stood 20 feet away, already reaching for another stone, his Letterman jacket gleaming in the afternoon sun. At 17, he moved through the elite boarding school like a young emperor inspecting conquered territory. His father's name hung on 3 buildings. His mother sat on the board, and every teacher, every administrator, every student knew the unspoken rule. James Lawton was untouchable. His crew laughed on cue. Phones appeared, angled for the perfect shot. A few students glanced over, then quickly looked away. The practiced blindness of those who understood survival in this world meant staying invisible. But across the manicured courtyard, seated alone at a stone bench with her calculus textbook open, Carmen Cowan stopped reading. She had been at Ashford for 3 months, long enough to decode its brutal ecosystem. Scholarship students like her existed in a carefully maintained silence. Work hard, speak less, disappear into the margins. Her father had taught her discipline, honor, and the precise difference between a fight worth taking and a battle that would destroy you. Carmen watched James wind up for another throw, the injured cat dragging itself desperately toward the bushes. And then she stood. Her movements were calm, purposeful, no theatrics, no announcement. She simply closed her textbook, tucked it under her arm, and walked directly toward James Lawton with the steady confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. The courtyard went silent. James turned slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to amusement to something sharper, something that recognized a challenge. His eyes narrowed as he took in Carmen. The press uniform that couldn't quite hide its second-hand origins, the lack of designer accessories, the quiet defiance radiating from her stance. "I'm sorry," James said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Did the hell just give me an order?" His friend snickered. Phones shifted angles. This was content gold. Carmen didn't flinch. "I said that's enough. Walk away." For a moment, James seemed genuinely surprised. Then his face hardened into something uglier, something that understood this wasn't just about a stray cat anymore. This was about power, about hierarchy, about a scholarship student publicly stripping away his carefully constructed image of invincibility. "You have no idea who you're talking to," James said quietly, stepping closer. Carmen held her ground. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. A coward who picks on things that can't fight back." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. James's jaw clenched. His friend stopped laughing. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone captured everything. The precise moment when Carmen Cowan painted a target on her back that would lead them both to the edge of that piranha pond. But right now, in this moment, Carmen calmly walked past James to scoop up the injured cat. She cradled it gently against her chest, turning to face him one last time. "You want to be feared," she said. "But fear only works until someone decides they'd rather stand up than bow down." She walked away without waiting for a response, leaving James Lawton standing speechless in front of his entire kingdom, humiliated, exposed, and already plotting his revenge. The war between them had begun, and neither of them knew yet that it would end with both of them in that water, with piranhas circling, and with Carmen facing the most important choice of her life, revenge or redemption, Wait, before I continue, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because this next part is insane. James Lawton had learned early that fear was currency, and at Ashford Academy, he was obscenely rich. His father's pharmaceutical empire had built the new science wing. His mother's charity galas funded the athletic program. The Lawton name wasn't just respected. It was carved into the foundation of everything that mattered. And James wielded that legacy like a weapon, sharp and precise, cutting down anyone who forgot their place in the hierarchy he commanded. He was 17, athletic in the way money could buy through personal trainers and elite sports camps, with a kind of casual cruelty that came from never once being told no. His crew, trust fund kids with hollow eyes and expensive watches, orbited him like satellites, reflecting his light, amplifying his power. They laughed at his jokes, executed his pranks, and looked away when his entertainment turned vicious. Because that's what survival looked like in James's world. Complicity or exile. Carmen Cowan understood this ecosystem better than most. She'd spent 3 months studying it with the careful attention her father had taught her, the same focus he drilled into her during early morning training sessions, teaching her that discipline was the difference between victory and defeat. Observe first, act decisively, never waste energy on battles you can't win. At Ashford, she was a ghost in press uniforms, her scholarship papers a scarlet letter she wore in silence. She sat in the back of classes, aced her exams without comment, and disappeared into the library during lunch while the entitled elite played their games of dominance and submission. She knew her role: succeed academically, stay invisible socially, secure her future, and get out. Her father's voice was a constant compass. Honor above all, even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. She carried that code like armor, even as she watched James and his crew terrorize their way through another day at the academy. The courtyard incident should have been routine. James throwing rocks at a stray cat, his friends recording, the student body performing their rehearsed blindness. Carmen had seen variations of this cruelty 12 times. Smaller infractions, quieter violence, the kind that didn't leave visible scars. She'd stayed silent each time, calculating the cost of intervention against the value of her scholarship, her future, her family's sacrifice. But something in the cat's shriek cut through her carefully constructed neutrality. Or maybe it was the sound of James's laughter, so casual in its sadism. Or perhaps it was simply that 3 months of swallowing her father's lessons while watching them violated had finally reached critical mass. She stood. The confrontation unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a chemical reaction. Carmen's steady walk toward James, her quiet command to stop, his shock morphing into theatrical amusement, then genuine rage as she refused to back down. The crowd's collective intake of breath when she called him what he was: a predator, a coward, someone whose power was built on targeting the defenseless. The word hung in the air between them like a thrown grenade. Predator. Not bully, not jerk, but predator. A word that stripped away the prep school polish and exposed something primitive and ugly underneath. James's face went pale, then flushed crimson. His friends stopped recording. The gathered students leaned in, sensing blood. Carmen picked up the injured cat and walked away, her back straight, her pace measured. She didn't run, didn't apologize, didn't even look back at the wreckage she created. James Lawton, heir and emperor, publicly neutered by a scholarship student who just committed social suicide. Behind her, James's hands clenched into fists. His jaw worked silently. And in his eyes, something dark and calculating began to take shape, a promise of retaliation that would make her regret ever learning his name. The 1967 Mustang had been Carmen's father's pride. 20 years of weekend restoration work. Every bolt and panel of meditation on patience and precision. Midnight blue with chrome that caught sunlight like liquid silver. It sat in the student parking lot like a time capsule, the only thing Carmen owned that turned heads for reasons other than her scholarship status. Her father had given her the keys on her 16th birthday with calloused hands and watering eyes, making her promise to treat it with the respect he poured into every inch of its resurrection. Carmen found it at dawn, 3 days after the courtyard incident. Someone had used industrial-strength spray paint, the kind that bonded to metal like a scar. Across the driver's side door, in dripping red letters, scholarship trash. The hood bore a more creative insult. Go back to the ghetto. And on the windshield, painted thick enough to obscure vision entirely. Your kind doesn't belong here. She stood motionless in the empty parking lot, her backpack sliding off one shoulder, keys dangling from fingers that had gone numb. The morning air was cold enough to sting, but Carmen felt nothing except the crushing weight of what this meant. Not just a violation of the car, but the erasure of her father's 2 decades of love and discipline. The pain had run down in arterial streaks, pooling where the panels met, like the car itself was bleeding. James's message was clear. Humiliate me, and I'll destroy what you cherish most. This wasn't random vandalism. This was surgical. He'd researched her, identified her vulnerability, and struck with the precision of someone who'd been planning retaliation since the moment she called him a predator in front of his kingdom. Carmen's first instinct was rage, the kind that made her hands shake and her vision narrow. But her father's voice cut through the fury with the clarity of a bell. Anger is gasoline. You can throw it on a fire and watch everything burn, or you can use it as fuel to drive yourself forward. Your choice, baby girl. Always your choice. She made her choice. Carmen walked to the hardware store 6 blocks away, bought paint remover, scrapers, and industrial-grade cleaner with money she'd been saving for textbooks. She worked through her morning classes, missing calculus and English, scrubbing at the hateful words with methodical focus. Students arrived for her first period and slowed their expensive cars to stare. Some took pictures. Most looked away with practiced discomfort. Nobody stopped to help. By noon, her fingers were raw and chemical burned, her uniform stained with red-tinged solvent. The words were mostly gone, though their ghosts remained in faint discoloration, a permanent reminder that some violations couldn't be completely erased. Carmen didn't cry, didn't call her father, didn't report it to campus security, because she already knew how that story ended. Budget cuts, no cameras in student lot. Very sorry, Miss Cowan. Boys will be boys, perhaps if you kept a lower profile. She sat on the Mustang's hood as the lunch crowd filtered into the cafeteria, her back straight despite exhaustion, her jaw set with the kind of determination that came from understanding a fundamental truth. James Lawton thought he'd won this round. He thought fear and money could break her. He thought she'd either run or retaliate with emotion, giving him the excuse he needed to bury her completely. He was wrong. Carmen wasn't going to run, and she wasn't going to react. She was going to observe, calculate, and wait for the perfect moment to remind James Lawton that predators weren't the only ones who knew how to hunt. She just learned to do it with honor, which made her infinitely more dangerous than he could imagine. The war had escalated, and Carmen Cowan was playing a longer game than James's rage-fueled mind could comprehend. Principal Whitmore's office smelled like old money and older secrets, leather-bound books, mahogany furniture, and the faint residue of expensive cigars that no smoking policy could fully erase. Carmen sat in the visitor's chair, her back straight despite the way the oversized seat seemed designed to make students feel small, and watched the principal review her written complaint with the careful attention of someone performing for an invisible audience. The photos Carmen had taken told the story clearly enough. The hateful slurs spray-painted across her father's Mustang, the racist epithets still visible despite her hours of scrubbing, the timestamp proving it happened on campus property during school hours. She documented everything with the precision her father had taught her, evidence over emotion, facts over feelings. Whitmore set the papers down with theatrical gentleness, his fingers laced together in a gesture that might have looked contemplative if his eyes hadn't been so cold. He was 50-something, silver-haired, with a kind of professional warmth that never quite reached past his dental veneers. The wall behind him displayed his credentials like trophies, degrees from legacy institutions, photos with governors and senators, and prominently centered a gold-framed portrait of him shaking hands with Richard Lawton at the dedication ceremony for the Lawton Family Science Center. "Miss Cowan," he began, his voice measured and soft, "I want you to know that Ashford Academy has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind." Carmen waited. She learned that the word, but always followed hollow promises like thunder followed lightning. But Whitmore continued right on schedule. "I'm troubled by the lack of concrete evidence identifying the perpetrator. Campus security has reviewed the footage from the parking lot cameras, and unfortunately, there's a significant blind spot where your vehicle was parked. Without definitive proof of who committed this act, my hands are somewhat tied. There are witnesses, Carmen said evenly. Students saw James Lawton bragging about it in the Commons area yesterday morning. I have 3 names. Hearsay. Whitmore's interruption was surgical. In matters this serious, we can't act on rumor and speculation, no matter how well-intentioned. The Lawton family's reputation, and frankly, their extraordinary generosity to this institution, demands that we exercise extreme caution before making accusations that could prove damaging. The quiet part said out loud. Carmen felt something crystallize inside her chest. Not surprise, but confirmation. She'd suspected this outcome the moment she decided to walk through these doors, but some part of her had needed to see it proven, to watch the system reveal itself. I'm also concerned, Whitmore continued, leaning forward with practiced empathy, about your behavior in the courtyard last week. Multiple students reported that you initiated a confrontation with Mr. Lawton, using inflammatory language that some found quite aggressive. Now, I understand emotions can run high, especially for students adjusting to Ashford's rigorous academic and social environment. He was torturing an animal. He was engaging with a stray that had wandered onto campus. Your intervention, while perhaps well-intentioned, was disproportionate and provocative. It created exactly the kind of tension that leads to incidents like this vandalism. Whitmore's smile was paternal, poisonous. Miss Cowan, your scholarship is contingent on maintaining not just academic standards, but also demonstrating the civility and discretion we expect from all Ashford students. Confrontational behavior, public accusations without evidence, continued conflict with established members of our community. These things reflect poorly on your judgment and, frankly, put your future here at risk. The threat wasn't even veiled. Stay silent, accept your place, or lose everything. Carmen stood slowly, gathering her photos with hands that didn't shake despite the fury building behind her ribs. Whitmore was still talking. Something about keeping open communication, his door always being available, hoping she'd reconsider her approach. But Carmen had stopped listening. She understood now. James Lawton wasn't her enemy. He was just a visible face of something infinitely larger and more corrupt. A system where wealth purchased immunity, where justice bent to accommodate checks with enough zeros, where a father's 20 years of discipline and honor meant nothing against a family donation that put their name on a building. Carmen walked out of that office, knowing she wasn't fighting a boy anymore. She was standing against an empire built on silence and complicity. And empires, her father had once told her, always felt the same way. One truth at a time, spoken by someone brave enough to refuse erasure. James Lawton had money and power, but Carmen Cowan had something more dangerous. Nothing left to lose, and the terrifying clarity that came with it. The Lawton estate sprawled across 47 acres of manicure perfection, a monument to generational wealth that looked exactly like the American dream was supposed to look. Colonial architecture with white columns that gleamed like teeth, gardens maintained by a staff of 12, a circular driveway that could accommodate 20 luxury vehicles during charity galas. From the road, it was a postcard. From inside, it was a prison with crown molding. James stood in his father's study at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, still wearing his school uniform, though the tie had been ripped from his neck hours ago. Richard Lawton sat behind a desk that had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, now him, a legacy of power passed down like a genetic disease. He was 52, silver-haired and square-jawed, the kind of handsome that photographed well for Forbes profiles and political fundraisers. His pharmaceutical company employed 4,000 people across 3 states. His donations built wings on hospitals and put names on university buildings. And right now, his eyes held the cold calculation of someone deciding exactly how much pain would constitute appropriate discipline. A scholarship student, Richard said quietly, his voice carrying particular danger of whispered threats. You were humiliated by a scholarship student in front of the entire school. Do you have any concept of what that does to our family's reputation? I handled it, James said, hating how his voice cracked slightly. The car thing was sloppy, juvenile, easily traced back to you if she'd been smart enough to push the issue. Richard stood, and James's entire body tensed involuntarily. You don't vandalize property like some common thug. You don't leave evidence. You don't engage in battles you haven't already won. I raise you to be better than this pathetic display of incompetence. The first blow came fast, an open-handed strike across James's face that sent him stumbling sideways into the bookshelf. The leather-bound volumes rattled. A picture frame fell and shattered. James caught himself on the edge of the desk, tasting copper. "You are a Lawton," Richard continued, his tone never rising, never losing that terrible composure. "That name means something. It opens doors. It commands respect. And you let some nobody with a free ride make you look weak in front of your peers. What does that say about you? What does that say about me?" Another strike, this one to the ribs. James folded, gasping, his fingers scrabbling against polished wood. He'd learned years ago that resistance only prolonged it. Fighting back meant the basement room, hours or sometimes days locked in darkness with nothing but his own thoughts and the sound of his father's footsteps overhead. A reminder that mercy was granted only when Richard decided the lesson had been properly learned. "You will fix this," Richard said, straightening his cuffs as though he'd simply been adjusting furniture. "You will remind that girl and everyone else exactly where they stand in the hierarchy. And you will do it quietly, intelligently, with a sophistication befitting your position. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir," James whispered. "Good. Now get out of my sight." James climbed the stairs to his bedroom on the estate's second floor, each step sending fresh pain through his bruised ribs. His jaw was already swelling, a purple-black shadow spreading beneath the skin. He'd covered tomorrow with the same lies he always used. Fell during basketball practice, took an elbow during a pickup game, tripped on the stairs in the dark. The school nurse knew better but never asked questions, because Lawton money paid her salary too. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, cataloging the damage with a clinical detachment he perfected over 17 years. This was minor compared to some nights. Nothing broken. Nothing that wouldn't heal in a week or two. Nothing that couldn't be hidden with the right lies and the right clothes. But something else hurt worse than the physical pain. The knowledge that Carmen Cowan had made him feel powerless, and powerlessness in the Lawton household was unacceptable. His father had made that devastatingly clear. James arrived at Ashford the next morning, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and moving with careful precision to avoid aggravating his bruised ribs. His crew noticed but didn't comment, because they'd learned to read his moods the way prey animals learn to read predators. Today, James radiated something darker than usual, something desperate and cornered and infinitely more dangerous. He spotted Carmen across the courtyard, walking toward the library with that same quiet dignity that had started this entire spiral. And watching her, James felt his father's voice echo in his skull. "Fix this. Remind her where she stands. Do it quietly and intelligently." The piranha pond, his family's estate, the party this weekend. An accident that wouldn't look like anything but her own tragic mistake. James smiled despite the pain in his jaw. Sometimes the best lessons were the ones you never saw coming. The library's third floor was a forgotten territory. Rows of outdated reference books and academic journals that hadn't been touched since the digital catalog went live 3 years ago. No security cameras, no foot traffic, just dust motes drifting through afternoon light, filtered by grimy windows. Carmen had discovered it during her first week at Ashford, a quiet sanctuary where she could study without the weight of hostile eyes tracking her every movement. She should have known James would eventually figure out her routine. They came at her from both ends of the narrow aisle between towering bookshelves, James flanked by 2 of his crew, Tyler Chun and Marcus Webb. Trust fund kids who'd learned that proximity to power was its own form of currency. The exit behind her was already blocked by another figure, a sophomore whose name Carmen didn't know, but whose eager expression suggested he was auditioning for a permanent spot in James's inner circle. "Thought you could hide up here?" James's voice was quiet, almost conversational, but Carmen heard the edge underneath, something sharper and more desperate than usual. His sunglasses were gone, revealing the purple-black bruise spreading across his jaw. Fresh damage. Recent. "We need to have a conversation about respect." Carmen closed her textbook slowly, her movements deliberate, buying seconds to calculate angles and distances. For against one, James favored his left side, protecting bruised ribs she could now clearly identify. Tyler was athletic but cocky, the type who'd learned to fight in expensive boxing gyms where nobody hit back hard enough to teach real lessons. Marcus was bigger, slower, probably counting on intimidation over technique. "There's nothing to talk about," Carmen said, standing and sliding her backpack onto both shoulders. Her father's training whispered through her muscle memory. "Keep your center low, use their momentum against them, strike decisively or don't strike at all. See, that's where you're wrong." James stepped closer, his crew tightening the circle. "You've been making me look bad. The cat thing, go to Whitmore, walking around like you own this place when you're just charity case who got lucky. That ends today. You're going to learn what happens when trash forgets its place." He reached for her shoulder, a dominance gesture, meant to push her back against the shelves and establish physical control. Carmen had been expecting it since the moment they'd cornered her. She'd been counting on it. Her response was fluid, economical, the product of 6 years of training that started when she was 11, and her father decided his daughter would never be a victim. She caught James's wrist with her left hand, stepped inside his reach, and used his own forward momentum to pull him off balance. Her right arm snaked around his neck in a rear naked choke. Her forearm pressed against his carotid artery with exactly enough pressure to cut blood flow without crushing his windpipe. James gasped, his hands clawing at her arm. His crew froze, uncertain whether to intervene or document the spectacle for social media immortality. "Don't move," Carmen said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her system. She increased pressure incrementally, feeling James's body go rigid with panic. "Your friends take one step closer, and you're unconscious in 4 seconds. I know exactly where the cameras aren't, and I know exactly how to make this look like you slipped and hit your head on the shelf." Self-defense is a beautiful thing. Tyler took a half step forward. Carmen adjusted her grip, and James made a strangled sound that stopped his friend cold. "Here's what's going to happen," Carmen continued, her lips close to James's ear. "You're going to leave me alone. You're going to tell your crew to leave me alone. And if you ever come at me again, with vandalism, with intimidation, with anything, I will make you regret that your father ever taught you that violence is how you solve problems. Because unlike you, I was taught discipline, control, honor. And right now, the only thing keeping me from putting you to sleep in front of your friends is that I'm better than the monster you're trying so hard to become." She released him with a controlled push that sent him stumbling forward into Tyler's arms. James coughed, gasping, one hand at his throat, his face flushed with oxygen deprivation and humiliation. His eyes met Carmen's across the narrow aisle, and she saw something shift behind the rage. Fear, yes, but also a terrible recognition that he'd fundamentally miscalculated who he was dealing with. Carmen picked up her textbook and walked past him without hurrying, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, but her expression calm as winter. Behind her, she heard whispered arguments, phones being raised to capture the aftermath, James's ragged breathing as he tried to recover both physically and socially from being dominated twice by the same scholarship student. She'd won the battle, but she knew with absolute certainty that she'd just guaranteed an all-out war. James spent 2 days planning Carmen Cowan's death with the same methodical attention his father applied to hostile corporate takeovers. Physical confrontation was off the table. She'd proven that humiliatingly in the library, and his bruised throat was a constant reminder that violence had hierarchies he'd never truly understood. But violence wasn't the only weapon available to someone with resources, property, and the kind of desperation that came from knowing failure meant facing his father's disappointment again. The piranha pond had been his grandfather's eccentricity, an exotic centerpiece for the estate's southern gardens that became a macabre conversation piece at fundraisers and galas. 73 red-bellied piranhas imported from the Amazon, kept hungry enough to maintain their reputation, but fed enough to prevent them from cannibalizing each other. The stone ledge surrounding the pond was decorative marble, slick when wet, with no safety railing because the Lawton family didn't believe in coddling guests with warnings about obvious dangers. James's plan crystallized with elegant simplicity. Lure Carmen to the party, engineer a confrontation at the pond's edge, create a scenario where a fall would look accidental, tragic, and entirely her own fault for trespassing on private property. The wealthy didn't face consequences for accidents that happened to people who shouldn't have been there in the first place. But he needed bait she couldn't ignore. Breaking into her locker was almost insultingly easy. Ashford Security was designed to keep outsiders away, not protect students from each other. James found what he was looking for in a small wooden box tucked behind textbooks. A silver locket on a delicate chain, tarnished with age, the kind of heirloom that carried weight beyond its monetary value. He opened it carefully, finding 2 tiny photographs inside, a younger Carmen with a woman who shared her eyes, both smiling with the unself-conscious joy of people who didn't know that time was finite. Her mother, dead, according to the sympathetic whispers he'd heard from the guidance counselor's office when Carmen first arrived at Ashford. Cancer, 3 years ago. The locket was probably the most precious thing Carmen owned. Irreplaceable, priceless, the kind of loss that would drive someone past caution into fury. Perfect. James sent the text at 7 p.m. on Saturday, just as his party was hitting critical mass. 200 students flooding the Lawton estate. Music pounding, alcohol flowed with the tacit approval of parents who believed unsupervised excess was a rite of passage for the wealthy. The message was simple. A photo of the locket resting on the stone ledge of the Piranha Pond, and a single sentence. Come get it if you want it back. Midnight. Alone. Carmen's response came 3 minutes later. I'm coming. James smiled, pocketing his phone and making his way through the chaos toward the southern gardens. Tyler and Marcus were already positioned near the pond, instructed to capture everything on video, but stay back until the crucial moment. The story would write itself. Scholarship student crashes exclusive party, confronts host aggressively. Tragic accident occurs. Wealthy family devastated by the loss of life on their property. Richard Lawton's donations would ensure the investigation stayed cursory. The media coverage sympathetic. The party swirled around Carmen as she walked through the open gates of the Lawton estate at 11:45. She wore jeans and her father's old jacket, moving through clusters of drunk teenagers with single-minded purpose. Students recognized her, whispers spreading like ripples. The scholarship girl, the one who'd humiliated James twice. What was she doing here? Carmen didn't acknowledge them. Her eyes were locked on the southern gardens, where lights glowed between manicured hedges and the sound of water, features mixed with distant music. She could see James' silhouette at the pond's edge, the silver locket dangling from his raised hand, catching moonlight like a taunt. She marched through the crowd without hesitation, past the mansion's marble columns, through the elaborate gardens where topiary animals stood like witnesses. Students followed at a distance, phones raised, sensing blood. The air was thick with jasmine and chlorine, and a particular electricity that comes right before violence. James watched her approach, his crew flanking him, the locket swinging hypnotically from his fingers. The pond behind him churned with shadow and hunger, 73 piranhas circling in their endless patrol. He'd won, finally. He'd found the lever that would move her past calculation into emotional reaction. Carmen stopped 3 feet from him, her eyes moving from the locket to his face with an expression that contained no fear, only cold, focused rage that made James's confidence waver for just a second. Give it back, she said quietly. Come get it, James replied, and dropped the locket into the water. The locket hit the water with a sound like a whispered goodbye, disappearing beneath the surface in a trail of silver bubbles. Carmen didn't think. Couldn't think past the image of her mother's face inside that tarnished metal, sinking toward the bottom of a pond filled with teeth and hunger. She kicked off her shoes and dove. The water was colder than she expected, a shock that stole her breath and made her muscles contract involuntarily. Chlorinated and murky, visibility dropping to near zero within seconds. She opened her eyes anyway, ignoring the chemical burn, searching for the glint of silver against dark stone. Her hand swept the bottom in desperate arcs, fingers scraping against algae-covered rock and the skeletal remains of whatever piranhas had consumed before. She found it wedged between 2 stones, the chain caught on a piece of decorative coral. Her lungs were already screaming for air, her vision starting to narrow at the edges. She pulled, felt the chain give, closed her fist around metal that felt like salvation. Then hands grabbed her from above. Tyler and Marcus had moved with practiced coordination, following James's whispered command. They caught Carmen as she surfaced. Gasping, the locket clutched against her chest. Before she could process what was happening, they shoved her back down with vicious force, using their combined weight to drive her deep beneath the surface. The crowd around the pond erupted. Gasps, screams, phones raised higher to capture the spectacle. Someone yelled for them to stop. Most just watched, frozen by the particular paralysis that comes from witnessing something terrible unfold in real time. Carmen hit the bottom hard, the impact driving precious air from her lungs in a burst of bubbles. She could feel movement in the water now. Quick, darting shadows converging on the disturbance, attracted by the thrashing that signaled wounded prey. Piranha hunting behavior was triggered by movement, by blood, by the electrical signals of panic that fish could sense through specialized organs. Her father's voice cut through the panic with absolute clarity. Discipline isn't about strength. It's about control when every instinct screams for chaos. Carmen went completely still. Every muscle locked. Every nerve shrieked for her to fight, swim, do something. She remained motionless as living stone, her body suspended in the water like a corpse. The locket pressed against her heart. She could feel the piranhas circling, their bodies brushing against her arms, her legs, curious but not yet committed to attack. They were predators evolved to detect struggle, to exploit weakness. Stillness confused them. Seconds stretched into infinity. Her lungs burned with carbon dioxide buildup, her vision dimming at the edges as oxygen deprivation began shutting down non-essential systems. Above, she could hear muffled chaos, shouting, splashing, James's voice calling out something that might have been triumph or terror. The piranhas lost interest, dispersing back to their patrol patterns. Carmen waited 3 more heartbeats, then moved with glacial slowness toward the far bank, away from the party lights and watching crowd. She used the shadows of overhanging willow branches as cover, pulling herself onto a muddy bank with movements so controlled they barely rippled the surface. She lay in the darkness for 30 seconds, coughing water, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and oxygen debt. The locket was still clenched in her fist, the chain biting into her palm hard enough to draw blood. She could hear the party on the other side of the pond, James's voice rising above the others, triumphant and cruel, already spinning the narrative for his audience. She went under. Did you see that? Crazy scholarship girl tried to attack me and fell in. Someone called campus security. I want her arrested for trespassing. Carmen stayed in the shadows, watching through the willow's curtain as James played his role perfectly, the innocent victim of an unstable girl's aggression, wrapping himself in protective armor of wealth and witness testimony. Tyler and Marcus had melted back into the crowd, invisible, their participation already being erased by convenient memory and social pressure. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed Carmen Cowan would panic. They'd assumed she'd react like their other victims, helpless, terrified, easily destroyed. They'd forgotten that she'd been trained by a man who understood that survival wasn't about strength. It was about discipline, control, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike back. Carmen pulled herself fully onto the bank, water streaming from her clothes, her mother's locket safe against her chest. She could see James clearly now across the pond, silhouetted against party lights, already celebrating his victory. He had no idea she was watching, no idea she'd survived, no idea that the predator he thought he destroyed was about to become something infinitely more dangerous, someone with nothing left to lose and every reason to ensure justice was served. The hunt had reversed, and James Lawton was about to learn what it felt like to be prey. Carmen moved through the shadows like something born from them, circling the pond while James basked in his perceived victory. Water dripped from her clothes in a steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat, controlled, purposeful, lethal. She could feel rage moving through her veins like electricity, demanding release, demanding that she make him understand what it felt like to be hunted, terrified, pushed toward death by someone who saw you as less than human. She emerged from the darkness behind him just as he was showing Tyler the video they'd captured. Carmen going under, the water thrashing, the moment of apparent triumph. His laugh died in his throat when he felt her presence. Turned to find her standing there like a drowned ghost, muddy and trembling with barely contained fury. "Surprise," Carmen said quietly. James stumbled backward, his face cycling through shock, fear, and something that might have been respect before settling on the defensive anger of someone whose plan had catastrophically failed. The crowd around the pond gasped collectively, phones swiveling to capture this impossible resurrection. How did you? James couldn't finish the sentence. Carmen didn't give him time to recover. She moved forward with the same disciplined precision she'd used in the library, but this time there was something different in her eyes, something that recognized she was past the point of civilized restraint. He'd tried to kill her, not humiliate, not intimidate, but actually end her life over wounded pride and a corrupt system that would have protected him from consequences. She grabbed his collar and drove forward, using momentum and his own backpedaling panic to force him toward the water's edge. James's feet slipped on the wet marble, his arms windmilling for balance. Tyler and Marcus moved to intervene, but Carmen's expression stopped them cold. This wasn't self-defense anymore. This was judgment. You want to know what happens when people stop being afraid of you? Carmen's voice was raw, savage. Let's find out. One final shove, and James toppled backward into the pond with a splash that sent piranhas scattering before they regrouped with predatory focus. He surfaced immediately, screaming, his hands thrashing as he tried to climb back onto the ledge. The water around him erupted with dark shapes converging on movement, on panic, on the blood that bloomed in the water as teeth found flesh. "Carmen, please, help me." James's voice broke into something primal, animal. "I'm sorry. Please. They're eating me." Carmen stood at the edge, watching him suffer, and felt a satisfaction so dark it terrified her. This was justice, wasn't it? He'd tried to murder her. He'd vandalized her father's car. He'd made her life hell for having the audacity to stand up for something that couldn't defend itself. He deserved this. He deserved to understand fear in its purest form. But then her father's voice cut through the rage with the precision of a scalpel. Honor is not about who the other person is. Honor is about who you are. The word stopped her cold. She was standing at a precipice not made of marble and water, but a kind of moral choice that defined a person's character forever. She could watch James die and probably get away with it. Self-defense. He fell during a confrontation, tragic accident. Or she could be the person her father had raised her to be, even when it cost her the satisfaction of revenge. Carmen dove into the water. She grabbed James under his arms and hauled him toward the bank with strength born from desperation and training. The piranhas scattered from her controlled movements, confused by the sudden appearance of another body moving with purpose rather than panic. She got James onto the muddy bank in the shadows, where she'd hidden away from the crowd's immediate view. His shirt was shredded, blood seeping from a dozen bite marks on his arms, shoulders, and torso. He was sobbing, shaking, going into shock. Carmen ripped her jacket into strips, applying pressure to the worst wounds with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. That's when she saw them, older scars beneath the fresh wounds, welt across his ribs in parallel lines, the distinctive pattern of a belt, cigarette burns on his shoulder blade, circular and deliberate, bruises in various stages of healing, some fresh, some yellowing, mapping a history of systematic abuse that suddenly recontextualized everything she knew about James Lawton. "Your father," Carmen said quietly, her hands still working to stop the bleeding. "He does this to you." James's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw past the cruelty and entitlement to the broken thing underneath. A boy who'd learned that violence was love, that causing pain was how you proved strength, that being a victim meant becoming a victimizer to survive. "It's supposed to make me strong," James whispered, and then passed out from blood loss and shock. Carmen held pressure on his wounds and screamed for someone to call an ambulance. Her rage transformed into something more complicated than justice. Understanding that monsters were usually made, not born, and that saving someone's life didn't require forgiving them, only recognizing their humanity. The Lawton family's lawyers moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, turning Carmen's act of rescue into attempted murder before the ambulance had even left the estate. By Monday morning, carefully edited video footage circulated through Ashford Academy. Clips showing Carmen shoving James toward the water, his screams for help, her standing at the edge watching him suffer. The footage that showed Tyler and Marcus pushing her under first, that showed James dropping her mother's locket into the pond as bait. somehow never made it past the family's legal review. Principal Whitmore called Carmen into his office at 8 a.m. sharp. Her suspension was presented as a formality, pending a full investigation that they both knew would conclude exactly how the Lawton family wanted it to conclude. 3 eyewitnesses, all members of James's crew, had given statements describing Carmen as the aggressor. The narrative was airtight. Unstable scholarship student with a history of confrontational behavior finally snapped and attempted to murder a fellow student. Carmen sat in that oversized chair for the second time in 2 weeks, watching her future collapse with the same methodical precision the Lawtons applied to everything they destroyed. Her scholarship was under review. Criminal charges were being considered. And most devastating, her father's expression when she called him from the hospital. The quiet disappointment of a man who'd taught his daughter honor only to watch her appear to abandon it. "I saved him," Carmen said, her voice hollow. "I pulled him out. I kept him alive until the paramedics arrived." "That's your version of events," Whitmore replied with the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script. Unfortunately, the evidence suggests a more complicated narrative. Carmen left his office knowing she'd lost. The system wasn't designed to protect people like her. It was engineered to preserve people like the Lawtons, no matter what truths needed to be buried in the process. But James Lawton was in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and confronting a truth that his father's beatings had never managed to teach him. Carmen Cowan had saved his life after he'd tried to end hers. She'd chosen honor over revenge, humanity over hatred. Everything his father said was weakness made into the strongest choice he'd ever witnessed. The scars on his body suddenly felt different, not badges of necessary discipline, but evidence of crimes his father had convinced him were love. And the thought of Carmen losing everything because his family's lawyers were better at constructing lies than she was at proving truth, it was the first thing in James's 17 years that felt genuinely, unbearably wrong. He made 3 phone calls from his hospital bed. The first was to his family's accountant, requesting documentation of every illegal expense his father had hidden in legitimate business accounts, including the permits that were never filed for a private pond containing dangerous exotic species, the bribes paid to local inspectors, the hush money distributed to cover up previous accidents on Lawton property. The second was to Carmen, a voicemail since she wouldn't answer calls from his number. "I'm sorry, and I'm going to fix this. I promise." The third was to the district attorney's office, requesting immunity in exchange for testimony against Richard Lawton. The empire collapsed faster than anyone expected. Federal investigators found a network of corruption that extended beyond illegal piranhas into pharmaceutical fraud, bribery, and financial crimes that made national headlines. Richard Lawton was arrested at a fundraiser, led out in handcuffs past the same politicians who'd accepted his donations. His wife filed for divorce within 48 hours. The Lawton name, once synonymous with power and prestige, became shorthand for everything wrong with wealth without accountability. Carmen's suspension was quietly rescinded. The criminal investigation disappeared. Principal Whitmore issued an apology that neither of them believed, but both accepted as the price of moving forward. James found Carmen in the Ashford parking lot on a Friday afternoon, 1 week after his father's arrest. He was thinner, moving carefully because of the healing bite marks, but there was something different in his eyes, the absence of that desperate cruelty that came from constantly proving you weren't a victim. He held out her mother's locket, the chain polished, the tarnish carefully cleaned away. "I had it repaired," he said quietly. "It doesn't make up for anything, but it's yours." Carmen took it, the weight familiar and precious in her palm. "What happens now? To you?" "I'm leaving. Staying with my aunt in Oregon. Finishing school somewhere that doesn't know my last name. Maybe figure out who I am when I'm not my father's project." James managed something that might have been a smile. "You taught me something. Honor isn't about winning. It's about choosing who you want to be when no one's watching." He walked away before Carmen could respond, climbing into a modest sedan that was probably the least expensive vehicle he'd ever driven. She watched him leave, understanding that some transformations required distance, time, and the courage to rebuild yourself from nothing. Carmen got into her father's Mustang, the paint ghost marks still faintly visible but no longer defining the car story, and drove away from Ashford Academy. She'd won, but not the way she'd imagined that first day in the courtyard. not through revenge or violence, or proving she could be as ruthless as her enemies. She'd won by refusing to become the monster that circumstances tried to make her, by standing for truth even when it cost her everything, by having tea